The Rwandan Genocide, the failure of the UN's diplomacy. After World War I, Belgium took over Germany's control of Rwanda. Belgium used a system based on race, Tutsis and the Hutus, where the Tutsis were more favored. This ignited racial debate between the two sides for many years, and after Rwanda gained independence from Belgium, sparked civil war. The UN, an organization established to maintain diplomacy, had left them after 10 soldiers were killed by Hutus. Rwanda was left with a genocide of 800,000 people, which gave the UN a wake up to where their position in the world is, making them give more resources to Africa, an overlook on their military support, a multitude of programs created to help the people in Africa, and better financing to UN organizations in Africa. Shortly after the surrender of Germany during World War I, the Treaty of Versailles came with it. The treaty forced Germany to give up some of its land, and gave penalties on their economies, and to give up all of the overseas colonies, one of these colonies being Rwanda. Each of these colonies was kept under supervision by the League of Nations, which would eventually pass to United Nations. The League of Nations was created after World War I to help resolve international debates and to monitor diplomacy globally. The League permitted Belgium to govern over Rwanda and Burundi, a nation next to Rwanda. Belgium began their rule in Rwanda by developing a government so that they could sustain themselves without too much involvement from Belgium. The government was based around the two major ethnicities in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus. The Tutsis were lighter in skin color, taller, and had a more fair complexion, so the Belgians gave them the power in Rwanda because they looked better than the Hutus. They were the leaders and high class of Rwanda now, given more privileges in education, while leaving the Hutus and Twa, another ethnic group, as the working class. The Hutus and Twa were not treated well with this arrangement. Many were in poverty, and many were in constant hunger. To regulate this new system, Belgium had created racial identity cards. Everyone was classified based on their race now. These cards would be used in Rwanda till their independence. In 1959, the Hutus, hurt by this new government process, was now in conflict and debate with the Tutsis. Tired of being oppressed over 2 decades, fighting would soon follow, and the Belgian government had brought in military support to maintain peace. Protests and fights erupted across Rwanda, demanding that Belgium would dismantle this Tutsi hierarchy. This is known as the Hutu Peasant Revolution and lasted from 1959 to 1961. Throughout the revolt, 150,000 Tutsis would flee the country, leaving a refugee crisis. So the UN General Assembly had agreed that the future of Rwanda can only succeed if they became a one-party state. So on June 27, 1962, Rwanda had gained its independence. Hutus assumed power in the government and immediately began crafting a new constitution. This did not cease the conflict between the Hutus and Tutsis. If anything, it increased it, as the long-suppressed Hutus began to repress Tutsi protests against the new government. Gregoire Kayibanda was elected as president, who, before the revolt, was a Hutu politician and radical, and helped eradicate the Tutsi hierarchy. During this time, many Tutsi political figures were often killed, or were forced to leave the country. This made it so that Tutsis could never rise to power. A coup would rise in northern Rwanda, giving way to a man named Juvenal Habyarimana, who was put in power in northern Rwanda. Soon, Habyarimana would gain enough political power to become president in 1973. He was president for many years, and gave the promise of unifying Rwanda all under one power, once and for all. Jump to 14 years later, to 1987, where the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, was created. The organization mostly consisted of Tutsis who were forced out of their homes many years ago. Many of those refugees became perfect candidates for soldiers, and they were built over one concept: overthrow the Hutu government. Tired of the 20 years of being repressed, 10,000 Tutsi rebels invaded Rwanda in 1990, which began the Rwandan Civil War, all under the leadership of Paul Kagame. Many ceasefires were called, many attempts at diplomacy that had failed. In over 3 years, the civil war had lost meaning. Eventually, in 1993, the RPF and Rwandan government found success during the Arusha negotiations, brokered by the United Nations, where they had agreed to share the power between both parties. They agreed on this because they were running out of resources and energy to continue fighting. Throughout these events, racial violence had still increased, so much so that the UN was called in to maintain peace and diplomacy. The UNMR was established at this time, a peacekeeping mission dedicated to Rwanda. Their main goal was to help keep the peace in Rwanda while they resolved their debate. The UNMR came to Rwanda on October 5th, 1993, and started helping with the refugees and humanitarian efforts, under the leadership of Jack Roger. This marked the UN's most significant attempt to end debate and establish diplomacy before the situation worsened. Tragedy struck in 1994 when President Habyarimana's plane was shot down. No one knows who shot down the plane or why. It didn't matter to the Hutus, who were extremely angered by this act. Habyarimana was viewed as a hero, trying to fulfill his promise of reunifying Rwanda. Over the radios, Hutu radicals were hyping up other Hutus, calling the Tutsis traitors, an enemy to the Hutus. The radios called out, "Cut the tall trees," and the Rwandan genocide had begun. Over the following 100 days, the Hutus would kill 800,000 Tutsis. Over 70% of all Tutsis were killed, and 80% of all Twa were also killed. The RPF during this time made action towards Rwanda's capital, hoping to finally end the war. The civil war ended when the RPF restored the capital of Kigali and when they captured the military leader Theonas Bagasora. Paul Kagame, the RPF military leader, would end up being Rwanda's next president in the year 2000. The UN, realizing that diplomacy had failed, largely abandoned Rwanda and evacuated. The day after they had learned that UN soldiers had been killed, they had requested that the UNMR would be disbanded. There are many reasons to why they did leave. One major reason is because of resources. The UN at this time were doing many peacekeeping missions across the world, and they couldn't spread too thinly. They couldn't stay in a hostile country with so little resources and even less soldiers. Despite all the warnings, the UN nations determined that they couldn't afford to help another nation that had already gained their independence. Instead, during debates over intervention, the Rwandan conflict was referred to as an internal conflict and acts of genocide, but not actually genocide. This internal conflicts ideology was used throughout Africa to keep the UN out of their troubles. The amount of refugees exiting to the Congo and many other countries left them all with the refugee crisis. Soon this would spread across Africa, and refugee crises would be seen all over. All these wars, rebellions, civil wars, and refugee crises in Africa eventually captured the UN's attention again. The UN had offered to establish many refugee camps across Africa, including in Rwanda. After the Second Congo War, they focused on repairing the damage that was left in all these countries. Rehabilitation centers, plantations, and education centers spread across Africa in an effort to help. In Rwanda's case, the UNMR returned and was tasked with establishing security and humanitarian efforts in the north and east areas of Rwanda. This process was seen all across Africa. Years later, many efforts to help out farmers with their land were done to help stabilize communities. Other ways they tried to stabilize them were more water filtration centers, charities towards construction programs, and an increased budget towards humanitarian efforts. Slowly, over time, Rwanda began to sustain itself, thanks to the UN. The Rwandan genocide was caused by racial debates stemming from a colonial history 80 years in the making. When the continent needed help the most, the United Nations had left them to their own devices, when diplomacy failed to protect their own interests. After the genocide, conflict spread and caused multiple problems across Africa, forcing the UN to get more permanently involved diplomatically. Today, they create sustainability across Africa with many peacekeeping missions and programs and give aid to those who need it at a bigger scale than they ever have before.